So I'm basically planning to talk more in terms of the content. And since this is an interesting topic and a conversation around the role of content in content-based pedagogies and teaching and language education, I felt my interest in literature and the way I ended up almost naturally drifting into peace studies was something that I could share with you and invite your own comments and reflections. So this is in a way an ongoing work. Okay. So this is broadly the talk that I was thinking of presenting and getting your feedback on. The way I have structured this is really in four parts to approach literature as a form, as a content, as well as a value in a way, and a value that maps directly to peace studies because it's already inherent and present within the literary space. There are four parts to what I'm planning to speak about. The first is to situate the idea of literature within current discourses in literature studies. What is literature studies doing today? What is it proposing, where it evolved, and where we are headed, the pathways that it opens up. In the second part of the talk, I'll be expanding this slightly more into the space of education as a discourse, as well as a transdisciplinary space of peace studies, briefly about its origins and some of its concerns, and then hopefully map this to the idea of literature studies in itself. The third part is a brief interpretation of a literary text that demonstrates the way content and literary interpretation can contribute to peace studies, because in the process of talking about reading, writing, literary analysis, stylization, and theme, you are doing a lot of peace studies. I'll conclude briefly with some reflections on critical pedagogies, and I have been listening to some of the talks earlier in the seminar and the entire conference as well, and I feel I don't really have to do too much work there because most of the presenters who have gone before me have laid the groundwork for that. Let me begin then with the first part, which is where are we with literature studies today? And at this point, I would also like to contextualize this before moving on, that while these are discourses from higher education spaces, there is always space and the importance to adapt it in meaningful ways to almost any level, whether it's graduate degree, school education, secondary, higher secondary. It is a flexible, transferable skill that we can use. So where are we with literature? I draw on Elaine Showalter, the feminist critic, the theorist who has spoken about women's writing, but who also very recently came up with this book called Teaching Literature, where she speaks quite poignantly about her experience as a literature teacher within undergrad and postgraduate spaces. She comes up with these 12 paradigms through which students can read and understand literature, which includes a range from recognizing language styles, subtle and complex differences in language, to figurative writing, moving on to interpretation as a skill and a critical pedagogy that gets used, understanding and detecting cultural assumptions. So literature is no longer just an artifact, it is also a larger thematic space that talks about life, culture, values, synthesis of ideas, creativity, everyday discourses that gets used. So it is not just, again, an esoteric discipline that puts people off, but it is completely and holistically connected to our very existence. How to think creatively about text, make connections between life, cultural communication, critical judgment, and defending, building arguments. It's a huge spread of abilities that students can gain from literature. But what is interesting is the way this entire spread is synthesizing different aspects together. So in the process of reading, I'm not merely engaging with language, I'm also engaging with the world. I'm engaging with creative imagination. I'm engaging with values. I'm engaging with the fact that the person who I'm reading about are different from me, and yet I can connect to them. That it is about informing my own decisions, but also respecting others' decision. And these are certain aspects that is embedded within literary texts. What is interesting, in fact, if you're able to see my screen, this is the book that she uses, and she concludes her book with two themes, one on teaching difficult topics, which involves war, which involves sexual use of language, racism within class, as well as teaching during dangerous times and dark times, which involves themes like self-harm or themes that can be quite disturbing. But her case for this matter is that literature as a discipline can enable that to happen, for the very nature is embedded within it, the empathy, the resilience, the values that literature has. Moving from a very contextual and a very thematic look at literature to a larger discourse on literature studies and literary theory itself. Peter Barry's again recent revisitation of this idea of beginning theory throws a lot of beautiful light on how historically the discipline has changed from the liberal humanist ideas that were propounded earlier by Arnold in the early 20th century, in the 19th century, in fact, about the timelessness of literary works, about literature being enough for and in itself, including the new critical approaches to close textual reading that evolved from this in terms of reading the words on the page and nothing else besides. Human nature is unchanging, organicity of forms, to a post-World War and a post-Cold War aesthetic of structuralist thought and critical thinking entering literature. Now, historically, the shift came because there was a recognition around the time of the World War and the Second World War that the humanist and the liberal humanist discourses in terms of the unchanging nature led to a certain fundamentalism. It led to essentializing, and it led to a certain superiority of one particular culture over the others. The fact that this can be dangerous and it can lead to mass destruction made people take a step back and bring a critical theory approach that said that identity is shifting and fixed, situated and constructed, being and becoming. It is situated at a paradox. We are constantly negotiating who we are, what we are, where we are, in a very, very fluid manner. That language is unstable, literature is unstable, and knowledge is political. So who uses language and who uses texts are the ones who are constructing new ways of living and new ways of making sense of the world. This ended up politicizing literature, but also with the emergence and the growth of deconstruction, something was lost. And what that something is what the current discourse, is what Peter Barry argues, is negotiating. So the last bit where we are saying changes in critical theory with the new humanities is really a balancing of the old tenets with the deconstruction approach. So what we are saying is there are certain timeless aspects, but these timeless aspects are universal within a context. So if I have to quote, for instance, Orhan Pamuk, who talks about this idea of universalism and how humans are alike in his Nobel speech, his point is all of us are looking for some very basic human values like love, like wanting to belong, like wanting to be a part of a larger society. We don't want to be in the margins. We don't want to be left out. And the cultural hybridity has reached a space where all of us are both at the center and the periphery. And this longingness to belong, to be a part of a co-constructed society, becomes a new form of a humanism. This humanism is peppered with the idea for evidence, proof, demonstrating concepts. So I just don't want to hear general ideas. I also want to know where these ideas are coming from. Can you give me some concrete evidence of why you feel that someone wants to be left out, where they are going to come from, and how they are going to propose those alternate ideas? The second lack that liberal humanism had, that was lost with deconstruction, is this idea of a spiritual realm, of some kind of an emotional anchor that a new critical approach to literature gave. But there is a need to come back to that because there is a certain lack. How the spiritualism and how this new meaning making activity happens for the refinement of the soul, for the self fulfillment, is a negotiating aspect right now that doesn't have a concrete answer. There is also a shift away currently from linguistic constructivist approaches to feeling, to understanding the human world, to understanding human experiences, and realizing that these human experiences are, like we said, essential, but also constructed. And finally, the reading of literature, if we are drawing from Elaine Showalter's idea of constructed criticism, of talking about one's own positions, arguments, and understanding the other, this point of crisis critique that Terry Eagleton, a Marxist critic, who does now an absolute about turn and say, hold on, I think we've reached the end of Marxism. We also need to take it ahead and look at understanding that we are living in a time of global pessimism. There's climate change, there's inequality, there's discrimination, there's hate speech, there is cancel culture, and these are realities for us today. Now, how are we going to deal with this crisis? How are we going to reconstruct and redefine those moral, religious, and ethical issues in manners that is truly equitable, in manners that really make sense for us as human beings? These are quite heavy burdens for a literary discipline to carry, but what the critics are also saying is it is quite capable of carrying it because of what it is as a creative artifact, as an artifact that talks about humanity as its theme. Building on this a little more, I move to the second part where I'm consciously trying to now look at this concept of education as a meta discourse, and from there move into the space of peace studies briefly as a transdisciplinary area, and hopefully build the connection between literature studies today's and the discourses, as well as the contemporary and 21st century discourses of what education and competence should be doing. So to again take off from where I ended the last bit on the 21st century skills on what is reality today, it's a world of globalized economy. It's a world of cosmopolitanism, which is actually a little more promising than globalization, simply because it acknowledges differences. It's a fourth industrial evolution. It is a world of a knowledge economy. Now, in this kind of a world where information, data, knowledge is really the one that's going to not just give you jobs, but also define the quality of your life, what is it that we need? Within this context, Bokova's statement within the work on rethinking education is really like a think piece on what we should be doing with education in the 21st century. Is talking about new forms of education. If our lives are changing, then the forms of education we engage in also needs to change. And here we need to move beyond literacy and numeracy. So yes, our FLNs are important. It is not possible to think of global good without basic skills, but we cannot restrict ourselves to just those skills. There has to be a focus on learning for greater justice, for social equity, global solidarity, global citizenship. And finally, these are the ones that are really going to drive us towards sustainable development, because we learn to respect and have dignity, human dignity, preserve it for everybody. If these become the global goods, then a global good that we are looking for within education, then there is, of course, a need to reassess, reinvent, and restructure how we are going to be dealing with these aspects within the language classroom in innovative ways. Freire had an answer to this. So, of course, Paulo Freire hardly needs an introduction, the Brazilian educator who's been talking so poignantly about a range of issues. And as early as 1965, he had been talking in terms of the different kinds of consciousness that education practice should be building. So he distinguished, in fact, three kinds of consciousness: the naive consciousness, the magical consciousness, and the critical consciousness. So for him, the naive consciousness is something when you read a text and you take it for granted. Okay, this is what it says. I'm going to believe it as it is. No thinking, likha hua hai, and that's about it. The magical consciousness is more supernational, superstitious, is located more in intuition rather than reason. The critical consciousness, on the other hand, he says, is what is required for a more equitable society. So I think the speaker before me was talking in terms of the banking model about the teacher as the person who gives the information and the students are the receivers. This was a banking model that Freire was actually consciously refuting and saying critical consciousness needs to ask questions. It needs to establish cause and effect. It has to be empirical. It has to be integrated with reality. So as a learner, I'm not outside reality. I'm not at an exchange. I'm situated within reality and I'm questioning it from within. And for that, when he talks about the act of reading, when he talks about the act of literacies, literacy is really an act of interpretation. It's about rewriting. So it's creative. It's about imagination, to be able to think and rethink reality, critical perception, and most importantly, it is political because it is counter-hegemonic. So when I do read a text and I'm able to look at those cultural assumptions underlying the text that Showalter had spoken about, or I look at the way language is constructed, the way the deconstructionists spoke about, what I'm really doing is, in the process of creativity, I'm rewriting it. I'm not taking it in a naive manner. I am challenging the power structures that underlie these constructs. And this is really where the idea of critical consciousness and critical literacies, cultural literacy, comes in to identify structuralist discourses of power, the idea of discourse itself, of life as a construct. And these are embedded within discourses of communication. When I speak, the everyday speech is also a discursive speech. And literature enables us to see that in a more nuanced way. I shift now to another transdisciplinary space, like I said, of critical peace studies itself. And I quote from this very recent work. Okay, if it's a 2013 work that still carries on, Tryphonos and Wrights, who talk about how critical literacies, literature, and peace education is really about understanding conflict, through difficult dialogues. The difficulty of dialogues that Showalter has already spoken about with respect to talking of difficult themes within classes, to dealing with emotional struggles, but it is also a dialogue that places human subjectivity and ontology. So, who am I is really the question of the question that I'm asking in the area of inquiry that these dialogues are dealing with. How are our borders and these different spaces I occupy constructed? How can I listen to someone else? How can I challenge the historical narratives of power? How can I embody knowledge in being? And in these instances, texts of whatever kind we read, whether it's literature or whether it's a meme or whether it's a graphic text, whether it's a film, whether it's a podcast, every one of these are constructed artifacts by human beings for human beings located within sociocultural contexts that are both essential being and becoming. And this opens the way to then ask us, what does conflict mean? What forms does it take? And how do I know if I'm dealing with a conflict? I might think my life is fairly straightforward. I don't have any conflicts. No one has killed me yet. I've not been poked. I've not been bullied around too much. Maybe I've been extremely lucky. But then where is this conflict? And here is where the father of peace studies comes in, Johann Galton, who as early as the 1970s, and even before that, his work had started around the time of the Cold War, but then it intensified post the Cold War with a lot of negotiations and diplomatic exchanges, which led to his setting up a space called Peace Studies in Norway. And that is today a huge area of research as well as capacity building. Galtung basically spoke about three different kinds of violence that we encounter in our everyday life. One of it is easy to detect, that is a direct violence. When I see a morcha, when I see beating, when I see war, when I see some kind of a physical violence happening, tangible violence happening in front of me, I can make it out. But the real kinds of violences that are difficult, that are long-term, sustained, and always already exist around us are the structural and the cultural violences. So the structural violence is the one that works with knowledge production and construction, my hegemonic ideals, my ideologies, who I believe I am, how my behavior should be, what behavior should I expect from others. And cultural violence related to culture studies, what clothes I wear, what food I eat, how do I respond to someone who's different from me, which leads to these points about intercultural competence. But these are the kinds of violences that he says affect survival, wellness, freedom, and identity. By wellness, it's not just physical wellness, it's not just about hospitalizing, but mental illness also. Am I really, truly happy? Am I truly fulfilled in who I am as a human person? Going back to the human rights of dignity. The spaces where it occurs, we also continue to think within the liberal humanist discourses about human society, but we cannot anyway at any point in time talk about it in isolation of the environment now. Climate change has reached a point of crisis. Ecological justice is more important right now than social justice. And in that sense, we need to start thinking of ourselves as part of the environment and vice versa. And this is where he says that the spaces where all forms of violence are formed are nature, human, society, world, historically with respect to time and culture. And the effects of these violences are material and non-material. You see destruction of environment, killing, mailing. But what you also see, which is intangible but even more painful, are loss of respect for life, trauma, alienation, discrimination, hatred, bullying, of not really connecting to the world around us. And it is in this context that he says that one of the major tasks that peace studies should be doing is to unmask structural violence behind the cultural violence of economism, of the direct violence behind the cultural violence of militarism. So there is economics and there is the military as the two major threats. And we are looking at the aftermaths of these as one of the major tasks of peace studies. If I'm then to connect the threads of literature, what literature does, and how this connects to peace studies and the education aspects, the themes that literary texts deal with are the themes of nature. And if we are looking at the world around us, then there is already almost always a necessary influx of these ideas within literary works. And this is also where Nussbaum comes in with saying that the ability to think peacefully, to think creatively, critically, and become a citizen of the world requires empathy, it requires imagination, it requires the need to step into another person's feet, to understand their predicament and to respond sympathetically to it. That really is then the larger goal of education in terms of intercultural competence, in terms of the values, and in terms of the structures that it can build. And this is something that Edward Said had also quoted almost like 40 years ago with his work, The World, the Text, and the Critic, where he speaks of a secular criticism which is situated. So, what you're really doing is contextualizing the work, contextualizing our lives, and reading it within a space of political, social, and human values. This is where critical consciousness comes. And it is entailed, according to Edward Said, in the reading, production, and transmission of every text. In all these cases, words like texts, works are expanded from just a written work to the larger context of the world, to the larger context of multimodal forms of representation. It is no longer restricted to just the written word, it is literally any thought that one might have. What then would be the new, renewed objectives of language education if we are to incorporate all? I would suggest that this involves reading aesthetics and aesthetic works as both poetics and politics. So it's not just beautiful. That edifice is required, but it is also incredibly political. A reading of a reading, writing, listening, and speaking tasks within language classrooms have the ability and need to become counter hegemonic acts that can build critical consciousness in terms of who we are and where we stand. Tasks required within the language classroom, especially through literature, have the potential to comment on and interrogate these power structures. And these are the power structures related to the different forms of Galtung's violence that can enable a certain counter discourse towards peace. A dialogic imagination is required, and this can only happen through difficult dialogues. To be ready to encounter those very uncomfortable questions that none of us wants to address, but that are necessary for us as human beings to survive in this world peacefully in a more resilient manner. Creativity is important, and this is again where Nussbaum comes in with, where she literally says that human dignity, respect, joy, and laughter are human rights as well. It is a right to life. We can't just survive, we need to live. And to live, there has to be imagination, there has to be creativity, there has to be sensitive expression and communication. Empathy, tolerance, compassion as values come in. Similarly, we need to become responsible global citizens, not just our own, because we cannot remove technology from our lives anymore. One flip into Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and I'm connected with the entire universe in ways more than I can imagine. And there is where this larger connection with the world needs to come in more than ever with the literary work. And finally, the building of competence, of intercultural communicative competence, as well as resilience. What this suggests is, if we then go back to Showalter, almost all these 12 points listed are not just what students learn by reading literature, but what are the values and competencies. Recognizing subtle and complex differences is a competency. Reading figurative language, differentiating figurative meanings is a value and a competency. Detecting cultural assumptions in writings about oneself is a competency. Thinking creatively is a competency. Working and learning with others is a competency and a value. Defending oneself and others is a value. And these elements are then not, it's impossible to separate them at any point in time. There are skills, but they build towards a much larger discourse of peace in themselves. What I'm now going to do is to briefly demonstrate a short act of literary criticism that takes into account the idea of a critical consciousness through a particular text. The text I thought I'll talk about is Persepolis, not just because I absolutely love this work, but also because I've been dealing with this text in different contexts in my classes at multiple levels, with teachers, with students in schools, with postgraduate education programs, and it is something that stands testimony to what a really timeless work of art is. The fact that Persepolis is a graphic novel, it is set in Iran during the 1970s to the 80s, during the point of Islamic fundamentalism. It is a memoir of an Iranian who is still in a slightly more privileged position than her compatriots, and talks about a culture alien to her own, has never stopped anyone to actually engaging with this work in a more nuanced way. I start here with a quote from the text, which is part of the introduction. In the introduction, Satrapi talks about how she wanted to rewrite the history of Iran, and she traces a 2,000-year history in a one paragraph. And then ends by saying that, so far in the 20th century, while there is this ancient civilization that had existed and that no one knew about, is now being seen as a fundamentalist, fanatic, terrorist space. It is also something that has been getting a lot of bad press, but that does not talk about the lives of the people who lived over there. She says, as an Iranian who has lived more than half my life in Iran, I know that this image is far from the truth. One can forgive, but one should never forget. And for her, this act of writing is an act of rewriting history, but also expanding the scope of history from an abstract space to the real, to the subjective, to the human and the humane. She talks about history as a memoir. She talks about history as episodes from little lives that she has lived, as a world literature where there is a constant shifting between the universal and the particular. So there is a constant looking at history as an abstract space, but then it is told through the life of a child. The main protagonist here is the child. So it's a form of a Bildungsroman. It evolves as a development of the character of a child over a period of some 10 years, where she sees her country change over time. It is in the first person narrative. It's based on a memory, so there is a certain fallibility in it. But this fallibility is consciously done, taking into account the fact that memoirs are personal narratives, that they are countering the grand narratives that don't capture reality and other different perspectives of reality. It is also very conscious that this is one version and one perspective. It is not the whole truth. This limitation, in fact, makes the novel an interesting and an easy space to navigate, simply because you are now told a story. And through the story, you are getting a glimpse into Iran. I'll deal first maybe with just the graphic representation of this work before taking an example of how the social, the personal, and the political intersect over here. As a graphic novel, as you can see, it is in black and white. This is an exact reproduction of the text. There are no colors over here. The choice of color is a very conscious choice that she deliberately, Satrapi speaks about how she deliberately took up this color because she was dealing with a very powerful and a very violent phase in Iranian history. There is a lot of bloodshed, she reports, and even demonstrates graphically of torture chambers and people being cut into 7 pieces. And she knew that there is a certain disturbing element to it. The choice of black and white was to lessen the blow without cutting down on the importance and the depth of truth. The violence that is there has to be presented, but it has to be presented in a palatable form so people engage and feel the horror without being repulsed or traumatized. But more than that, when I read the text, I also feel that this choice of color is a form of a indirect commentary, a work that literary texts do. A commentary that is history always black and white? Is it always about panels and neat structures? Is it always about one person telling the truth and everyone listening to it? The black and white, in fact, plays with the fact that gray areas are missing, and it's the gray areas that we really need to focus on. When we think of the themes, it covers a huge range of themes, including war and politics, history, nation building, gender, fundamentalism, but it also does it in very subtle ways. So if we take the example of class, for instance, the first panel is introducing us in this episode to the character of Mary. So briefly, this is a story of Mary, who's a maid who works in Satrapi's house, in the child's house. And this young girl had come to her before she was born. So the first panel, in fact, says that her parents dropped her off, saying, we have 14 to 15 children, we can't take care of her, she'll be happy over here. So they are a peasant family, they don't have the money, they have a lot of children, and they drop the child off. And Margie's parents adopt her. And they adopt her, they take her in, and they keep her there. And when Margie is born, she takes care of Margie. So she says, she was just 10 years old when I was born. She took care of me. If you look at that panel, you see a 10-year-old throwing an infant in the air and playing with her, hardly an example of taking care of. But there is a subtle humor within it. It shows one child taking care of a smaller child, and there is an obvious class differentiation that has come in already. It's a conflict and it's a discourse of privilege. And this discourse of privilege, in a way, grows as we see that despite Mehri being an outsider, there is a very human, connected bond that builds between Mehri and between Margie, who is the child protagonist. As it grows, this Mehri falls in love with a boy next door, and somehow the father finds out about it. So he goes and tells the boy that she's actually a maid, she's not our daughter. The boy breaks off the engagement and it's all hell breaks loose. But then basically, Mehri, it's a failed love story. One of the things that then happens is this child is very, Margie is very disturbed. She has seen her parents fight the revolution. She says that they've been out there picketing and fighting against the regime, and she just doesn't understand it. She said, how can you be so unfair? Why can't they have a relationship? And her father says, you must understand that their love was impossible. Margie says, why is that? Father says, because in this country, you must stay within your own social class. There is a very clear demarcation of economism, the economism that leads to cultural violence, structural violence embedded within the conflict of the plot itself. And yet, even though these ideas are abstract, our experience is very real. Every one of us has seen this. Most of us continue to perpetrate it. Willy-nilly, it is a part of the society we live within. But the point really is recognizing it and recognizing that there is that injustice. It concludes with this last panel. Margie is confused and she says, is it her fault that she was born where she was born? Are you for or against social classes? She's genuinely confused because her father is out there fighting against social class and he comes back and does the same to his daughter, to the maid there. But there is no resolution to this plot. She says, when I went back, she was crying. And the most powerful line in that entire sequence, we were not in the same social class, but at least we were in the same bed. A certain sharing, a caring that only children can do the way they do best, is in fact a critical commentary on everything that is wrong with a class-based social structure, everything that is wrong that denies human essences, that denies human subjectivity, values, the desire and the ability as well as the right to love and live life the way we want. In a way, this work, like all good works of literature, are examples of how these discourses of conflict as content are embedded within literary works, and a close reading in terms of looking at the modality, in looking at the color schemes, the paneling, the words on the page, the stylization, the humor, contributes to a certain counter-hegemonic reading that can inform our own perception of how we view the world, of our own honest reflection on our own world and where we stand, and whether we can try to be a little kinder and a little more empathetic than we already are. So I think I'm really at the last part of my presentation here. To just take this ahead, how do we then enable this within the language classroom? It is actually not difficult at all. I hope that it has become, I've been able to demonstrate at least to some extent that these discourses of peace, of structural violence, and the need for critical dialogues and difficult dialogues are already always embedded within literature. And the need for literary spaces, literary studies, and language classroom today to take those discourses of education, to take the discourses of critical consciousness seriously, because that is the only way we can survive going ahead. If we are to do that, and if all the ingredients are already there, what it really requires is a little bit of a trigger to get it activated. So if we are looking at it along these three rubrics of objective design and material curation, classroom interactions and assessments, I think, again, Professor Leena's talk earlier today was a beautiful introduction. She's, in fact, already done almost all my job over here. But an adaptation and a transference of some of those ideas to think of ways of navigating this space of peace studies within literary classrooms. Objectives, suppose we start thinking in more concrete ways of listing social, cultural, and ecological justice, resilience as curricular objectives, where a more prominent space for that, among the other skills, definitely reading, writing, listening, speaking, being able to communicate, being able to do all the other tasks to get the job and get going are important, but so is being a good human being. Can we make it a curricular objective that can enable us to also rethink different ways of enacting it? Choice of literary works is important. Stephen Krashen has said before that content is king. It is important. One well-chosen work means a large part of your class is taken care of. Literary works are rich because they are layered. It is important to select works that enable difficult dialogues, that deal with difficult themes, but deal with them in nuanced ways, that use humor, that use imagination, symbolization, a lot of different ways that stop us from taking a singular stand to the text. So it is really about non-didactic works, works that allow and permit multiple points of view to come forward, that deny an ending. Sartrapi's ending, and this is again and something I'm speaking from experience. When we had a discussion around this letter, I think one of the students suddenly came back and said, "How can you call this a text of social justice? There is no justice over here. She should have got the boy. This is so unfair." And my point was that the very fact that a text from Iran has provoked an Indian student in the 21st century to make a statement of this kind means it has succeeded in its purpose. It has succeeded in invoking enough fury in you, and enough of that discomfort that Margie doesn't get, that Mary doesn't get to be with the boy she loves, is has made its point. Sometimes you don't need complete concrete morals. What you really need is a provocation of that sense of ethics and justice that's already embedded in us as readers and in students and learners themselves. So we trust that, and we pick those kinds of texts that allow multimodal representation, stylization, aesthetics. So it enhances the experience of reading, the joy of reading, and the aesthetics that really is literature. Related to this very literally is the classroom interaction. So I agree very much with the previous presenter who was talking about a flipped classroom. The best way of doing literature, apart from reading together within groups, having peer conversations, is also at least first to ensure that they read it from by themselves, silently, quietly, for pleasure. It is not for a purpose. Literature is worth reading in itself, and we need to promote that discourse more than ever. Now, if we are doing that and we are coming back with ideas, there is time to reflect. One of the ways in which we can break that water tank, or the banking model where we're telling children what to think. We are allowing learners to come back with their responses. Classrooms need to be spaces for discussion and critical reflection, in which case, as an educator, our role is really in thinking about important prompts. What are the kinds of themes we can identify? How are we going to structure the prompt to enable critical reflection rather than just a yes no answer? Using the Socratic method to build arguments. So, how can I actually use questions and answers to get students to think? Because criticality and critical thinking is really the core of a lot of difficult dialogue. The dialogue is really the key word there. Projects, presentations, group works are remarkable ways in which we can get to engage with the idea of peace, because very often this is where we are getting the chance to think about other people's perspective. Collaborative team building, group work comes when there are these kinds of presentations and projects that they're doing beyond the class and coming forward with it. I also feel individual reading, writing, and reflection tasks in multimodal forms are important. This is a practice that I have been using in my own classrooms and my teaching and in different contexts for the last few years. And I have always found that when students are doing a constant journaling, including doodles, for instance, or taking pictures, or getting back to the reading and writing tasks, over a period of time, the reflections are incredibly rich. They have time to think, and they've also been able to mobilize creative tasks to capture certain critical ideas. One strategy that worked for me very recently in one of my literature classes was when I gave them time for silent reflection and reading within the class. So the first 15 minutes was really about giving them books, read it right there, because they come back saying, "Ma'am, time nahi hai. We are never able to read. We have too many assignments." And we know that is a fact. They're not really fibbing in that sense. But suppose we create that space. Maybe we are looking at one theme split over two classes and we are making space for silent reading. It might just be worth the effort. Scaffolded reading of difficult themes is important. There have been times when I have had to seek the help of counselors on how to deal with difficult topics that deal with, say, violation or trauma. And one point that was told to me was to allow the learners to see how comfortable they are dealing with it. So if there is a point where someone feels they don't want to talk about it, that's all right. They needn't. They can come to it when they are ready. And it has worked, because invariably there have been cases and students have come back later personally and told me this is what we feel about it, because they did get to it on time. And this is where creating safe spaces becomes important, to recognize differences in learning patterns, and in the process of learning patterns to also allow for that kind of new ways of learning to happen within the class. And finally, how do we reimagine the assessments? While the continuing summatives will be there, Work like literature for peace literally requires thinking in terms of competencies, thinking of innovative, interesting, important, and new ways, imaginative ways of doing these assessments in terms of formative projects, creative writing exercises, because a competency really that needs to be built to be able to transact these spaces are critical thinking, creativity, imagination, empathy, resilience, understanding cultural, intercultural competence. These cannot be measured. They should not be measured either. There has to be space for plurality. There has to be space for subjectivity. There has to be space for drafts, for portfolios, creative tasks, documentation of the world around them in different ways. So they're probably going and out there and doing an ethnographic study where they're talking about one scene around them, taking pictures, perhaps doing a vlog, doing something like a blog post that they are writing, photojournalism, multiple ways in which the engagement with the act of reading is enacted and made more meaningful for them. I think I'll stop here and I'll be happy to take questions.